Hey guys, welcome back to Record Rundown, the series where I do deep dives and analysis of some of the most iconic records of all time. Today I bring you episode 2, where we're going to be focusing on one of my favourite albums of all time, Guns N' Roses' phenomenal 1987 debut release, Appetite for Destruction. So we're going to be doing a deep dive into some of the history of the record, what makes this album so great, and a bit of a spoiler alert, I have pretty much nothing bad to say about this record. It is one of my absolute favourites ever, potentially what I believe to be the best album ever released, certainly in the rock genre. But before we get into the video guys, please don't forget to leave a like if you enjoy the video, subscribe to Orange Bear Records if you want more awesome music content, and hit that notification bell so that you don't miss a single upload. Guns N' Roses, now one of the most iconic rock bands of all time, burst onto the LA club scene not long after forming in 1985 with their original lineup of Axl Rose as frontman and lead vocals, Slash on lead guitar, Izzy Stradlin rhythm guitar, Duff McKagan on bass, and Steven Adler on the drums. The promising young band were eventually signed to the label Geffen Records, who were quick to release a 4-track live EP, Live Like a Suicide. But this is commonly accepted as a bit of a throwaway release to satisfy the label whilst they were getting ready to produce their debut album, because at the time the label didn't believe that they had enough songs to fill out a full album. This is actually interesting to think about because the amount of material that was held back from Appetite for Destruction and eventually ended up on Use Your Illusion, songs like November Rain, Don't Cry, Back Off Bitch, You Could Be Mine, all of these songs were written during the Appetite era and originally intended to be used on Appetite for Destruction, but were then held back to later releases, and of course that was the right decision because we got them in their own phenomenal context. But it's interesting to think that they could have ended up on Appetite for Destruction, and also the label didn't believe they had enough content for the album despite having all these songs that eventually were carried over. And we can definitely say that it was the right decision to hold back material like November Rain and Don't Cry that had a bit more of that softer ballad style that wouldn't have fit in with the hard rock genre that Appetite was going for. A lot of the songs that ended up on Appetite are believed to have been written before Guns N' Roses even came together as a whole band. For example, It's So Easy was written by Slash, Duff and Steven before they met up with Axl and Izzy to form Guns N' Roses. And a lot of songs on the record seem to have been reflecting experiences that they've had up to that point. So for example, Welcome to the Jungle was about an experience that Axl and Izzy had in the middle of the city, and Mr. Brownstone was written by Slash and Izzy about their heroin addictions and fleshed out by Axl, who actually, contrary to popular belief, was not into drugs in the same way that the rest of the band were. It's interesting to think that the album initially struggled in its first year or so, but eventually songs like Paradise City and Sweet Child of Mine were getting a lot of airplay on the radios, and despite critics absolutely bashing it, saying it only got its success through the sex, drugs and rock and roll attitude, the fans absolutely loved it, and soon it skyrocketed to number 1 in the US charts and remains the best-selling debut album in American history. Not only that, but it is also the 7th best-selling album in America of all time, which for a debut release is quite phenomenal to think about. And before we move on to some of my further thoughts on the album, I just wanted to mention the original artwork because I kind of feel like it's a bit of an interesting story about how passionate Axl was about the original artwork and the symbolism that it meant to him, but the label decided that they wanted to change it because it was too explicit for the commercial success that it eventually went on and got. We can all say that was a sensible decision and the right decision, and the skull and cross art that you can see behind me has become so iconic. So yeah, 100% that was the correct decision. So like in the last episode, we're going to be following a sort of structure so that we can compare records across the entire series. So we're going to be starting off with my favourite track, then going into my least favourite track, an underrated pick, and then finally rating every single track on the album out of 10 and giving it an overall score at the end as well. So we're going to start off by diving into my favourite track on the album, and just like the last episode, we're going with the opening track. I can still remember the first time that I'd properly heard this song. I was probably about 9 or 10 years old, and I'd not long heard their cover of Live and Let Die after my dad had played it to me. And I went into the kitchen where we had the tablet that was hanging up on the wall that controlled our music, and I decided to look up this song, Live and Let Die. I remember he told me it was Guns N' Roses, so I typed Guns N' Roses in and it came up, and the first song to come up was Welcome to the Jungle, and that title really caught my eye. I was like, oh, that sounds interesting. I put the song on and instantly I was absolutely blown away because I was treated to this phenomenal track. Now, I would probably go as far to say that this is the greatest opening track from any album ever, which, come to think of it, is probably a good idea for a video, the top 10 opening tracks of all time. Although I may have kind of spoiled it now, but oh well. I don't think any opening to a record has given me the same unique feeling as this one has, and the song fits so well into the hard rock genre while still maintaining so many unique qualities and making itself stand out. So a huge part of what makes this such a brilliant opening track is Slash's intro riff. I mean, he starts with that because it's tuned a half step down. It's the B flat but on the G string, but then he also catches the B flat on the string above on the B flat string, which sort of creates this extra dimension to the sound. You can see it across so many iconic records that when they double track guitars, they'll play the same notes at the same pitches but on different strings, and it really gives it this, like I said, different dimension of the sound, because the thicker or thinner strings playing the same pitches can really add that extra width. On face value, and certainly to those who don't play guitar or don't necessarily understand music in the same way that others do, this might seem very insignificant, but it's these subtle qualities that are really so impactful in iconic records and really help them stand out from others in the field. And then there's the main riff that comes after this awesome build up, and man, this is one of the absolute greats of all time. I mean, we go back to that same concept of the same pitches but on different strings, because you've got Izzy playing the traditional A chord shape, and then you've got Slash playing that power chord shape on the low E string, and again that really gives that extra dimension to the sound like we spoke about earlier. But again, it's such a unique hard rock riff that manages to stand out for being unique but still holds so many qualities of what makes hard rock songs so good. And I just love that, again, traditional A chord shape, and then pulling that G note on the bottom string. It's actually G flat, again tuned half step down, but just giving that slight bend, and it gives so many nice dynamics to this intro riff. And then also we need to mention the amount of like little hidden licks in this song, and my favorite one comes at the end of the main riff when Slash uses this sort of going down that A flat minor pentatonic to transition into the verse. And I think that's what this song does so well in so many cases, is he's got so many little licks that transition the sections and make it feel seamless, and that's what keeps the song moving forward so nicely. And one last thing about the guitars before I get carried away talking about them, as I always tend to. Slash moves into this single note rendition of the main riff for the verse, which is a lot softer. It brings down that dynamic and really creates some room for Axl's awesome vocals to come in. And speaking of the vocals, this is probably some of Axl's best work ever, and it is on the first track of the first album. Axl is one of the greatest vocalists and frontmen in the history of music altogether, full stop. He is absolutely phenomenal, and the work that he does on this track is outstanding. Kicking it off with that scream or moan across the intro riff, it really helps the build into the main riff. And then of course when the vocals come in the verse, we're introduced to one of the most iconic voices in all of rock history. And also at the end of the chorus you have the sha-na-na-na-na-na-na that I try to do every time I hear the song. I try to sing along with it and fail every single time. I think Axl is just so unique, and every performance you hear him singing, it's phenomenal, and he has to go down as one of the greatest frontmen and vocalists that the world has ever seen. And finally, I just wanted to talk about the bridge section after the chorus, which brings in some of Duff and Stephen's work that really rounds out how good this track is. So you got Stephen with that jungle style drums that really sort of bring in the jungle theme of the title while still maintaining that hard rock sound. And then of course you've got Duff's ascending bass riffs and then going into a descending thing, and that really sort of rounds out that jungle sound and makes the song unique in that sense, because it brings what we typically consider to be a jungle music sound into a rock sound. So could you class that as fusion? Maybe not, maybe that's a bit of a stretch, but still it really rounds out the theme of the song, and I think it's one of those, again, small details that can often be overlooked. But I suppose now I say that, many of you who haven't really thought about it in that light, maybe you'll see what I mean, and all of that time that you did realise that, but maybe couldn't put it into the same words. So it's that's an interesting point. I just wanted to give my honourable mentions, like I did in the last video, for my favourite tracks on the album, and that's going to go to Mr. Brownstone and Paradise City. I mean, Mr. Brownstone for me is just one of them awesome songs. It's filled with brilliant guitar parts, great vocals, an awesome drum intro. It's a full package of a song for me, and certainly in terms of Guns N' Roses songs, it can often be overlooked. I think it is one of the best songs that they've ever written. As I mentioned earlier, it's about the band's heroin addiction. I believe Mr. Brownstone is a bit of a metaphor for heroin. I've also heard an interpretation that it was actually their heroin dealer that they were giving the nickname Mr. Brownstone, but I've always believed it was the metaphor for heroin. And then that chorus, "You've been dancing with Mr. Brownstone," was the whole idea of taking heroin. I just love the interplay between Slash and Izzy's guitar parts in this, and if you want a bit more context as to that, go and check out my top 10 Guns N' Roses guitar riffs video right after you finish this one, because that goes into some of my favourite Guns N' Roses riffs ever, and Mr. Brownstone is in there. So if you want to see that, please do go and check that out. But yeah, everything about this song is pretty much perfect, and yeah, it's so close to being the number one on this list. And then we also have Paradise City. I think the best way to describe this song is it's just an absolute roller coaster. I mean, we start off with that clean chorus intro, then into Slash's lead intro, and then that awesome guitar riff that's become so iconic, really brings in the hard rock theme to the song. And then we go through the main sort of verse chorus structure and all that with the guitar solo in the middle, and then that outro. I mean, that is when we really get the whole roller coaster vibe, and it's imagine the whole song's just been building all the way up to that final drop, and it all of a sudden goes absolutely mental. We get the faster version of that riff in the solo. It's absolutely phenomenal. And again, this track is so close to being the number one, but the fact is that Welcome to the Jungle is just that good a song in my opinion, that Paradise City comes a very close second. Now we get to the pick for my least favourite song on the record. And like I mentioned earlier, I don't think there is a single weak song on this album. I think every single track is brilliant, but I have to pick my least favourite as per the structure of these videos. So I am going with Think About You. Now, again, like I said a minute ago, I don't have any real problems with this song. I just think it's the weakest out of a bunch of extremely strong tracks. I think the only reason I'm putting it as weak, and I'm just trying to find some reasons now to make it weaker than the rest, but I think if we talk about the chorus, for example, I don't think it's got as memorable hook lines as the rest of the albums. I mean, if we compare some of the more iconic chorus lines, like Take Me Down to the Paradise City, We've Been Dancing with Mr. Brownstone, Here I Am, You're a Rocket Queen, and we compare that to Think About You, Honey, All the Time My Heart Says Yes, it's not quite as strong. Like, and again, I'm trying not to diss it, and I feel like I'm backtracking myself whilst I'm saying this, that this is not a bad song in the slightest. It's just not quite as strong as the litter of super hits across this record. I think the riff's slightly more forgettable, and that's the thing about the song on the album really, is that it's forgettable because it's surrounded by such great material. I think if this was on any other album by any other band, the song is much more popular than it is today from a Guns N' Roses perspective, because it's just surrounded by such brilliant material that it almost gets lost amongst its counterparts on the record. That said, there are still brilliant performances across it. I think every member of the band does a solid job. Certainly Axl, I think the vocals on this track are great, despite the hook not being as strong as some of the other tracks. And just as always, it's a solid song. A really enjoyable track, but it does have to be my least favourite on the record. And now we come on to what I think is the most underrated track on the record, and I am picking Anything Goes. Now, this song is an absolute belter, and it's my underrated pick because I think it gets nowhere near the credit that it deserves. I mean, the riff at the start is one of my favourites. It obviously keeps that very bluesy style that Slash and Izzy are so accustomed to. And again, that blues rock style can really be seen across the rest of the song. Like we talked about in Welcome to the Jungle, the little joining licks between the sections. Certainly in the chorus, you've got those little riffs that really join the different parts of the chorus together and make it flow nicely. And I think you can see in the writing that just comes naturally to Slash and Izzy. The way that they join their parts and the way that the guitars sort of speak to each other, it's like, in some cases it's a bit like a call and response, maybe less so in this song than some of the others, but you can see how naturally it comes to them, and their thought as writing together is to write parts that complement each other, and the way that they do it so naturally, I think they are potentially the best lead rhythm combo that we've ever seen. And you can debate about that for ages. There's loads of combos we can talk about. Again, another idea for a video. Leave in the comments if you want me to do that as a video, because I like that idea. But yeah, I think the combo of them is just so special, and you can see how naturally it comes to them to write those kinds of parts. As with every track, we need to mention Axl Rose's vocals, because that chorus, My Way, Your Way, Anything Goes Tonight, it's just so powerful and punchy. A bit like in contrast to what we talked about with Think About You. Whilst this maybe isn't as iconic as some of the other tracks we talked about, the hook is still really memorable and punchy and gives a great impact. So I am choosing Anything Goes as my most underrated song on this record. And now we come to the part of the video where I'm rating every single track on the album out of 10. And at the end of this part, I'm going to be giving an overall score for the record and wrapping up my final thoughts as well. So to kick things off, we've got Welcome to the Jungle, the phenomenal opening track. Like I said earlier, probably the best opener to any album ever. I'm not going to go too in depth about this one because I talked about it earlier, and I'm going to save a bit of time to talk about some of the others now. But Welcome to the Jungle for me is just a perfect song, and I'm going out right now. I'm giving it a 10 out of 10. It's my favourite on the record for a reason. It's perfect. There's absolutely nothing I'd change about it, so it is getting a 10 out of 10 to kick off our list. And following that, we've got the second track on the album, It's So Easy. And I really think this song serves a purpose of cementing that hard rock sound. After we hear that phenomenal opener, it just comes in and gives us something that's designed to blow your socks off. You've got Duff's opening bass riff and then that build on the drums from Steven, and then we burst into that main opening riff, which gives such a heavy feel. And like we talked about in the last video about how modern metal can be oversaturated with distortion because they're kind of playing catch up to these records where they manage to achieve such a heavy sound without having to turn the gain up all the way. And I think It's So Easy is a great example of that. It's a really heavy riff. And then we see another side of Axl's vocal performance because he sings in a much lower tone here, and he's also backed up by Izzy's vocals as well, which match that same sort of style in the lower register, but it contrasts a lot of the more higher pitched, hard to achieve vocals that we hear on Welcome to the Jungle. I just think this is an all-round solid song, and I don't really have anything bad to say about it inherently, but it's not quite as strong as some of the others, so overall I'm going to give it a 7 out of 10. The third track on the album is another one I wanted to put as an honourable mention for my favourite track, but if I did, there'd be a huge long list, and I'd just keep letting tracks in, so I had to narrow it down to just 3 tracks for my favourite and 2 honourable mentions. But we have Night Train, and again this is another very iconic song, especially amongst Guns N' Roses fans and guitar players. It is such a fun track to play. I mean, again, that main opening riff, we've talked so much about how Slash and Izzy's parts are so well intertwined with each other, and this is really interesting because you see Slash playing the chord version of the riff and then Izzy's playing a single note version. An important thing to note about this album as well is how Slash and Izzy's parts were produced, and in the albums that followed as well it was very similar. You had Izzy's part was panned to the left and Slash's was panned to the right, and like I talked about earlier, the parts always really meshed well together and they were well intertwined, and it was almost like you could have a call and response sort of style thing with them, but they also feel like 2 distinct separate tracks as well, because you could take one earphone out, you could take the left out, and you could still hear just Slash's part on its own with a little bit of Izzy's, and then you could swap them over and you just hear Izzy's part with a little bit of Slash's. So you could hear 2 very distinct guitar parts, but when both speakers were going at the same time, both headphones were on at the same time, you really get a very nice overall picture of the 2 guitar parts working well together. And I think this is really relevant in Night Train because you've got Slash playing that chord version and then Izzy with the single note version, and it really creates a great overall soundscape across those 2 speakers that is very impactful. It's got a great groove in the verse that really gives the song an awesome feel, and I have to mention Slash's outro solo as well, which I've actually been learning recently. I'm getting very close to getting it right, and it's so fun, it's amazing, it's got such awesome feel, and it really rounds out a fantastic song. So overall I'm going to give Night Train a 9 out of 10. Track number 4 is Out to Get Me, which is also one that featured on my top 10 Guns N' Roses riffs video because I think the riff is absolutely fantastic. This is another song that could have been in line for the most underrated song on the album because I don't think it gets as much credit as it deserves, but the riff is really what makes this song so special to me. It's one of those that makes you screw your face up when you listen to it, and again there's not really much more to say about it than that. Axl's vocals are great as always, and it's just a solid song to fill up the album, so overall I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10. Then we have another one of my absolute favourites, the 5th track on the record, Mr. Brownstone. As I talked about it briefly earlier, the guitar parts are phenomenal. The opening drum part from Steven Adler combined with that muted wah from Slash really gives the song a nice opening, and it's quite a hard sound to replicate as well. Even for them live, it was a very interesting way to kick off that song, and this song again really showcases Axl's vocal talent because it almost borders between your traditional rock singing but also rapping as well. The way he gets some of those syllables out so fast in such quick succession is very impressive. Again, we talked about a bit of the context of the song earlier and what it's about, so I'm not going to dive too much into that now, but overall I absolutely love this song. It is one of my favourites on the record. Like I said earlier, could easily have been my favourite if Welcome to the Jungle wasn't so phenomenal, but I'm giving this track a 10 out of 10. Absolutely nothing I change about it. Brilliant song. Can't knock it in the slightest. Also getting a 10 out of 10 is Paradise City, which finishes off the A side, or the G side as they call it, because they have side G and side R. But yeah, it's got to have a 10 out of 10. There's no point in making you wait for my score with this one. It is one of the best tracks on the album. Again, if Welcome to the Jungle wasn't so phenomenal, this could easily be top spot. It's one of those songs with so much depth to it. Like I talked about, that opening clean chorus riff followed by Slash's iconic lead intro, then that main riff on the lower strings there. Again, the interplay between Slash and Izzy's parts, a common theme across this record, with Izzy's slightly lighter playing and playing also that harmony part above it as well. And then I don't know a single person, certainly in my experience with other musicians, that doesn't know that iconic chorus, "Take me down to the paradise city where the grass is green and the girls are pretty." It's like, if you don't know that song, you have been living under a rock. And funnily enough, I did actually come across somebody the other day, not in the music world, outside of that, who's very much into a lot more how do we put it, modern crap, a lot more modern music, stuff that I find to be total rubbish. And this person had never heard this song before, ever, didn't recognise it when I played it to them, and I quite frankly couldn't believe it. Like, who doesn't know this song? It's so iconic, and it's one of those that will live as a cultural favourite forever. It's one of those songs that you hope will never die. But as soon as you see this sort of new generation of music and music listeners coming in, and certainly younger people seeming to value music a lot less and not wanting to listen to it in the same way that it was in the past, things like this are starting to get lost to time, and cultural iconic songs like Paradise City, will they be around forever? Again, please discuss in the comments below, because I want to hear your thoughts on that. Do you think that there will be songs that will last forever, or will all songs eventually be lost to time? I need to hear your thoughts on that one. And again, this is another idea for a video. Who thought that one video could bring about so many ideas for more content? Kicking off the B side, or the R side, as we mentioned a minute ago, we have My Michelle. Again, one of the songs on the album that I think could have been the underrated pick. This is another one of those songs that, like we've talked about already, carries over that common theme of the guitar work being so well intertwined in the relationship between the two guitar players, really showing through. And again, Axl's vocals, it's the same old story as per the rest of the album. Everything about each of these tracks, it really holds those same overall themes. So I feel like I'm repeating myself here, but it's such an important part of every single track. When even the tracks on the record that are considered as deep cuts are so well known, you know you've done something right. It's another one of those songs that's just absolutely solid. It's a brilliant one to fill up the album. And again, ended up being a great song in its own right, despite not being one of the bigger hits on the album as well. So I'm giving it an 8 out of 10 overall. Next up, we have Think About You, the track that I picked as my least favourite on the album. And again, I've already talked about it quite in depth already, so I won't go into too much detail here. But again, it's a great song. It's a solid song. I don't really have any problems with it, and the only reason I picked it as the weakest on the album is just because it's slightly more forgettable than some of the super hits around it, and that's the very point. Everything around it is just so strong that it kind of gets lost to that. But overall, I really enjoy the song. I'm going to give it a 7 out of 10. Because I think it's a solid song. It's just not quite as good as some of the others on the record. And next up, we have what is probably the most famous Guns N' Roses song of all time, and that is Sweet Child of Mine. Now, this song is iconic for a reason. It is so well written. It didn't quite make the honourable mentions list for my favourite song, just because I prefer some of the other songs over it, and this, obviously, it is one of the best tracks on the record because it's one of the most famous. It was a super hit, and it's really enjoyable. It's so well written, but for me personally, I prefer a few of the other slightly more hard rock hits over it, but that doesn't take away from how awesome of a song it is. It's actually a very interesting story as to how it was written. Apparently Slash and Izzy were downstairs in their apartment, just noodling around guitars and sort of playing together. Axl Rose was in the room above them and just started writing lyrics to what they were doing. So it was kind of a throwaway song that they had no idea would end up being as big a hit as it was. It's one of those songs that as soon as the first few notes are played, you know exactly what track is playing. That riff is iconic. Again, we talked about how earlier somebody didn't know Paradise City. Everybody knows Sweet Child of Mine. Like, I have never come across a person who does not know that song. I hope I never do, because it is such an awesome song. Again, it's culturally iconic, and chances are somebody says Guns N' Roses, the first thing you think of is Sweet Child of Mine, and for good reason. Slash actually famously hated the song. He never really liked it and thought that the solo was the only redeeming section, which, well, it's probably incorrect, because the rest of the song is fantastic as well. The solo is my favourite part. It's sort of split up into two halves, one slightly slower section, easy to play, and then you've got that awesome run into the second half, which is much faster, with the wah pedal really in full effect as well. And something that I always find funny about this song is how after the solo, the bridge section with the vocals, Where Do We Go Now, that actually came about because they didn't know where they wanted to go with the song when they were writing it, so they just decided to do "Where Do We Go Now?" And that was the lyric as they came into the outro of the song. So I always found that as kind of a funny little interesting quirk about the song. So overall, for my personal taste, I'm going to give this song a 9 out of 10. It could quite easily be a 10 out of 10, but for me, I just wanted to add that slight gap between that and my favourite tracks on the album, because this is one of my favourite tracks on the album, to be fair. It's just not quite as good in my personal opinion as the other ones that I've already given a 10. After that, we've got You're Crazy. I've not got too much to say about this. Again, a lot of it's already been said as a common theme across a lot of the other tracks. It's just a great hard rock song. It's one of those, it's always enjoyable. Nothing too overly memorable about it, but it's always an enjoyable track, one that I like listening to. So I'm going to give it a 7 out of 10 overall. Then we've got what was my underrated pick on the album, Anything Goes. Again, I've already spoken a lot about it already. Such a nice bluesy style to it, great hard rock riff in the opening. Axl's vocals are so powerful in the chorus, and I actually quite like how the solos take place across that sort of like soundscape or soundbox, if you like. We've got the solo on one side, and then the next phrase of the solo goes to the other side, and it feels like it's been recorded in separate parts rather than panned. It really goes back to that idea of a call and response that we talked about earlier. It's like one phrase on one side is the call and the response on the other. I've always really liked that detail about the song, and it's also got one of my favourite uses of a talk box as well in that main riff. It really adds that extra dimension to it. So overall, I'm giving this song an 8 out of 10. It's up there with my favourites, and it's a really underrated track, so I'm giving it an 8 out of 10 overall. And the final track on the album is Rocket Queen, and this song just goes so hard, and so is Axl, if you know what I mean. It's got a great drum intro and then a nice guitar build into that awesome main riff. It's another one of those that's got such great feel. Those little palm mutes between the parts of the riff really add that extra nice little bit of feel to it. And then I love the chorus as well, Here I Am and You're a Rocket Queen. And then we get into a really cool slide guitar solo by Slash, which is backed by some of Axl's endeavours, shall we say, that were recorded live in the studio. That's one of the many stories about the different tracks on this album, that part of what make it so unique and so special and make it stand out from a lot of others on the record, because that sex, drugs and rock and roll attitude that we talked about from the critics earlier is really embodied in this album in every single track, with the different stories behind them, and I think that's part of what makes it so special. And then of course, after the bridge that follows the slide guitar solo, we get some awesome riffs inside that as well, and then a brilliant guitar solo to close out the song. Again, I've got absolutely nothing bad to say about this song whatsoever. It's a great solid song. I always enjoy listening to it. So I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10 overall to close off the album. And finally, we're going to be rounding out the video by giving the album an overall score out of 10. And for those of you who in the last video liked the calculated score, that's on the screen right here now for you. That was a score that was calculated from the average of every single track on the album score that I've just given. But for my personal ranking, like I mentioned in the last video, I feel like some of the weaker tracks on the album don't necessarily bring down my opinion of the album as a whole, because it's the collective of the tracks together that really make it what it is. Because I really think that the combination of those really strong tracks and some of the maybe more filler tracks are the complete package, and I can feel about the whole album in one way without that dragging down my overall opinion. So for me, this album is perfect. Like, there is absolutely nothing I would change about it in the slightest. There's a reason that it is the best-selling debut album of all time in America. There's a reason that it is the number 7 best-selling album of all time overall, and there's a reason that it was a debut album that went to number 1 in the US charts. And for those reasons, I am giving this album a 10 out of 10. There's not a single track I will ever skip on this record when I listen to it. There's not a single track that I think, oh, this one's on, I've got to get through it. There is not a single track that I think is weak in any sort of way whatsoever. It is just an overall stunning, phenomenal record, and I'd probably say that it is my favourite album of all time, and what I believe to possibly be the best album of all time, certainly in the hard rock genre. So that wraps things up for today's video, guys. I really hope you enjoyed episode 2 of Record Rundown. If you haven't seen it already, episode 1 is up on my channel, where I dive into another one of my favourite albums ever, Kiss's Destroyer. And also, if you love Guns N' Roses too, I'd recommend you check out my top 10 Guns N' Roses riffs video that I already mentioned earlier in the video. Definitely go and check that out. It's some of my best YouTube work so far, I think. I really enjoyed making it. It was super fun. And I think it's a really cool video, so go and check that out. Also, I've got some suggestions already as to what episode 3 should be. I've got them down in the bank. That was all left in the comments of my last video. I already had this one planned as episode 2. So episode 3 will be coming out very soon as well. But if you have an album that you think I should check out in future episodes, then please do leave it in the comments below, because this series is about me discovering new music as much as it is about reviewing the albums as well. And the whole series is designed to get us talking about some of the most iconic records ever, gaining different perspectives about different records, and hopefully opening us all up to new music that we've never heard before, and really broadening our range and our knowledge base of different music, different artists. So I really hope this series is successful in that way. Please don't forget to leave a like on the video if you enjoyed, subscribe to Orange Bear Records if you want more awesome music content, and hit that notification bell so that you don't miss a single upload. But for now guys, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.